Good day, and welcome to the fourth podcast in our series, A Canadian Foreign Intelligence Service, brought to you by the Policy Insights Forum, a unit of the Samuel Group of Companies. I'm Geoff St. John, your host, and the director of the Policy Insight Forum's National Security Studies program. With me today is our technical specialist, Geoffrey. The aim of this series is neither to try to convince listeners that Canada should have a foreign secret service, nor to argue that Canada should not have one. Rather, the intent is to bring out the pros and cons of the issue and let you, the listener, decide for yourself. We are most pleased today to have with us Mr. Vincent Rigby. Mr. Rigby was the National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Canadian Prime Minister in 2020 and 2021. He has had a most distinguished career in Canadian public service in multiple departments, including the Privy Council Office, National Defence, and Global Affairs Canada. He was, for example, both an Associate Deputy Minister and an Assistant Deputy Minister at Global Affairs, the Vice President of Strategic Policy at the Canadian International Development Agency, the Executive Director of the Intelligence Assessment Secretariat at the Privy Council Office, and the Director General of Policy Planning at National Defence. And he was the Privy Council Office's official responsible for the coordination of the Canadian intelligence community's effort in support of Canada's mission in Afghanistan. Clearly, he was both an intelligence provider and an intelligence consumer throughout much of his career, rendering him most qualified to talk to us today. Mr. Rigby is now Professor Rigby at the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University in Montreal. Sir, welcome to the podcast, and our sincere thanks for you for agreeing to join us today.
Thanks very much, Geoff. It's my great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
We're going to do something a bit different today, and that is have a debate about whether Canada should have a foreign intelligence service. So I will ask our guest to begin by laying out why he thinks Canada should have such a service, and I will proffer several reasons why I think Canada should not. Sir, over to you. Is a Canadian Foreign Intelligence Service past due, in your opinion?
So let me reframe the question just a little bit, Geoff, if I could. And I promise I'm not trying to dodge the question. I will get to my own views about whether I think we're ready for a foreign intelligence agency or not. But I think before we can come to a definitive conclusion, we really need to do a thorough assessment of our foreign intelligence needs and requirements in the government of Canada. And once we do that, we can come to an informed decision. People like to say that there's been lots and lots of debate in Canada about the need for a foreign intelligence agency for many, many decades. And it's true amongst academics, amongst commentators, amongst former practitioners, heads of CSIS, former national security advisors. But the government has looked at it, I would say, in a very episodic fashion. It's come and gone as a topic for governments of Canada, depended on the government serving at the time, what the international security environment was. But most of the time, these debates really flittered across the screen and then disappeared. I was quite taken the other day by a comment that Wesley Wark made on your show when he was talking about some of those episodes where a foreign intelligence agency was discussed within the government of Canada. And he referred to an anecdote back, I think it was in the early 1950s, when George Glazebrook, a diplomat within what was then the Department of External Affairs, did a study on a foreign intelligence agency and presented the findings to the Undersecretary of State, the Deputy Minister Arnold Heaney at the time. And these names mean something to me because I'm an historian. I studied Canadian foreign policy history. And Wes said that he read the report and then wrote in sort of very abbreviated form, this is quite interesting, we're able to do it, but not today.
Yes.
and Wes made the joke about how it was the polar opposite of Winston Churchill saying action this day. This was action someday distant into the future. It was a great anecdote, and it really struck me because having spent 30 years in government, that's kind of what we've been doing ever since. I would suggest that for 75 years, there's been a lively debate out in the Canadian public, at least amongst informed observers, but within the government of Canada, It's being punt. I use lots of football metaphors, but punt it down the field. We really don't want to deal with it today. I think the time has come for the government to really grasp this bull by the horns and come to a decision one way or another. And by a decision, I don't mean we're not really sure what we want to do, so let's not think about it and punt it. Let's make a definitive decision, yes or no. And in order to do that, you need to do a full-up assessment of what the foreign intelligence needs are, what we're doing right now in Canada, and then what the gap is. And we haven't done that. I read a review recently, or an article, I should say, saying that this thing had been studied to death. Well, it's been studied to death by academics, and it's been studied to death by commentators, but not the government of Canada, in my view. And I think the second important point is that when we do this assessment, we don't do it in an isolated, siloed fashion. I believe I've said this since I left government, and I was making a bit of a play for it even when I was the National Security Intelligence Advisor, that it's time for Canada to do a broad review of its national security. That if you look at the security environment right now, you look at where the world is, you look at where Canada is, we need to look at the state of our national security and the tools that we have to confront our national security challenges. The last time we did a national security full-up review and produced a policy, our only policy, was right after 9/11. Our national security policy is now 20 years old. I mean, it's basically not in existence anymore, but it's 20 years old. I would suggest that in 2024, our security environment is every bit as dangerous as it was in 2002 or 2003, if not more. I could make that argument quite easily as well. So it's time to do a full-up review. And as part of that review, the question should be asked, of all the tools that we need to confront our national security challenges right now, do we need a foreign intelligence agency? And I would even suggest that the government goes so far as to appoint a blue ribbon panel headed up by a former head of CSIS or a former NSIA. I'm not lobbying for the job, I promise you. It's a lot. Go out there and do a public, transparent review of whether we need a foreign intelligence agency, and have a public version of the report, have a classified version of the report, and then plunk it before what we now finally have, plunk it before the National Security Council, chaired by the Prime Minister, and let the Prime Minister and his key ministers have that debate with officials on whether we actually need this or not. And so, again, I'm not dodging the question, because I think on balance we probably do need one, but I think we need to really study it intensively and really open up the hood on our foreign intelligence capabilities, what CSIS does, what CSE does, what the Canadian Armed Forces do, and figure out what a separate agency or a more robust suite of foreign intelligence capabilities would actually do for us. What is the value added here? What's the net benefit in terms of a cost benefit analysis? To answer your question more directly, do we actually need one? Let's pretend that we did appoint a blue ribbon panel. The government appointed a blue ribbon panel, and then it reported a year out, 18 months out. What do I think it might conclude? Well, I think it would first of all conclude that the environment that we live in right now, the security environment, is pretty dangerous out there, and that we need a full suite of intelligence tools to respond to that environment. So as Wesley argued with you, and I would fully concur with this, you can't just do the signals intelligence piece. You can't just do what the CAF does. You need a very robust human intelligence capability to respond to the current security environment. And I would not suggest we do foreign intelligence. CSIS does foreign intelligence, but I would suggest perhaps it's not robust enough given the world that we live in right now. We can talk about that in more detail, and I can give you some specific examples. The second thing I'd say is that the blue ribbon panel might conclude that we need intelligence that's specifically tailored to Canadian interests and to Canadian intelligence priorities and to our foreign policy priorities, whatever those priorities may be. I have a difficult time discerning those these days. We love to say in Canada that we're a net importer of intelligence within the Five Eyes, and it's true. We get a lot of intelligence from the UK, Australia, and in particular the United States. But there are times when we need intelligence that's for distinctly Canadian purposes. And I can give you some examples as we delve into this in a little bit more detail. But we're a member of the Western Alliance, NATO, Five Eyes, but we do sometimes find ourselves out there a little bit on our own, whether it's with China and the two Michaels, or our relations with Saudi Arabia, or recently what's happened with India and potential complicity of the Indian government and the assassination of a Canadian citizen. We need potentially intel that's tailored to meet those contingencies and those crises. The third thing I think a Blue Ribbon panel might conclude is that yes, we get lots of intel from Five Eyes and from other friends and partners, but we cannot guarantee that it's not going to be cut off at some point. Now, this argument is often made, and people roll their eyes and go, that's never going to happen. Yes, that's occasionally stated offhand that we may lose our intel sources in the United States if we get on the wrong side of the US or we don't pull our weight, but they would never do that to us. I'm not so sure anymore. I would have made that argument 10 years ago, but given what's happening in the United States right now, given that we could potentially have another President Trump in November of 2024 or January 2025 when he comes into office, given the things he has said recently about defense spending, 2% of GDP, that he would not defend an allied country if they were invaded, for him to say, you know what, you're not pulling your weight, we're not going to give you intel anymore, would that be all that different than saying we're not going to defend you in case of an attack if you don't do your 2% spending? So I just think that it's no longer just an absolute worst case scenario or a very unlikely possibility that this might happen at some point. So we have to keep in mind that I don't think it's a high probability, but it's a low probability, high impact that we may see some of our intel cut off down the road. And so we'll need every source we possibly can get. And then the final point I'll make, Jeff, is just any kind of a commissioner, inquiry, or panel into this may talk about credibility and reputation. And this kind of ties into my Trump comment. We don't have the highest standing internationally these days. We don't have the best reputation amongst our allies in terms of our defense spending, in terms of stepping up on the world stage, in terms of doing our share. What better way to impress our allies, our closest friends, including the United States, including President Trump, than to say, hey, guess what? We are actually going to establish our own foreign intelligence agency. I think if we do create our own foreign intelligence agency, it should be for Canadian national interest and for our own purposes. But as an added advantage to be able to say to our allies, look what we've done, and for us to burnish our reputation a little bit would not be a bad thing. So on balance, I would suggest that I would lean towards us needing that foreign intelligence agency, or at least an enhanced capability, whether it's in CSIS or an independent agency altogether. We'll probably get into a little bit. But let's go and do the assessment from a government point of view and really dig into this, and not just have rather one-off conversations that don't go very deep on the margins.
Very cogently argued. I particularly agree with the requirement for an assessment, a full-up assessment of what would be involved in having a foreign intelligence service. We need a very honest assessment. Here are the pros, here are the cons, here are the upsides, here are the downsides of having a foreign intelligence service, which I don't think the government has ever really, any government has really tackled as yet.
I don't think so. And again, not to keep on invoking Wesley as much as I like him, and he's a great colleague, but he mentioned 3 or 4 occasions. I've been in government 30 years. I'm not aware of a real root and branch review. So let's do it. Let's make it as independent as we possibly can. As I say, a blue ribbon panel with former practitioners, experts, academics, people who really looked at this and really studied it, and then present it back to the government, and then have a really thorough discussion within government. I think that's the way to go.
One of the things that has struck me as I've looked at this over the years is that there is often an opinion piece put out in a newspaper like the Globe and Mail, or a study by a university, which will not talk about the necessary and not very pleasant tactics that an espionage service because this is what we're talking about, an espionage service, that the tactics are not really discussed. At least some Canadians, I think, would be horrified by the thought of Canadian intelligence officers using what are, after all, the necessary tactics: psychological manipulation, deceit, bribery, perhaps even sophisticated blackmail. Would not the views of these Canadians militate against the creation of foreign intelligence service?
Well, that's why I think you really have to educate Canadians about the nature, not just of a foreign intelligence agency, but the nature of national security, the nature of our intelligence community, security intelligence community, what we do, what the tactics are, what the strategies are, et cetera, et cetera. There's a huge gap in knowledge amongst the Canadian public about all of these things. And it's one of the reasons why I would be keen on having a thorough review of our national security so we could actually inform Canadians about what we do and the kinds of things that we do. So it's not just about the tactics of foreign intelligence collection, but what we do writ large, and even at the political level. I think it's a question of culture, right? We don't have that mature culture in Canada, in government, or in the Canadian population writ large.
Yes.
So I think that we need to communicate. We need to communicate better, and the government has to show leadership. I lost count of the number of times people at the political level came to me and said, "Well, we don't spend a lot of time on defense, or we don't spend a lot of time on security intelligence because our constituents tell us it's not important to them." But governments shouldn't just take their lead from public opinion. They should shape public opinion. They should put the issues that are really, really important to the country as a whole and to the people of Canada, put them out there and let's have the discussion. So I think that's the start of my answer in terms of that broader debate that has to happen in Canada. On a foreign intelligence agency specifically, I mean, everything you say, I take that on board, but you need a communication strategy, right? And as a joke, I'm not necessarily sure that I'd write the communication strategy, Jeff, along the lines you just put it out there. It does smack a little bit of 007 and CSIS agents leaving a trail of bodies behind them and nefarious tactics and what have you. All of our intelligence agencies work within a legal framework. And even in terms of our foreign interference activities, foreign intelligence, I've got foreign interference on the brain these days, given everything else that's been happening. Our foreign intelligence activities, there's a legal framework there. We have a very robust review and oversight governance structure in Canada. NSIRA, the National Security Intelligence Review Agency, NSI-COP, the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, the Intelligence Commissioner, who keep a check on these things. We have strong legislation, et cetera. And I think with foreign intelligence, we'd have to probably strengthen that legal framework even more and put in place those rules and regulations and legal requirements to make sure that we did not have people out there running amok. I mean, you've said a couple of times, I think, in previous podcasts, this notion that a foreign intelligence agency is almost like a rogue element that goes out there and does this stuff. I think that's exactly what we don't want to present. They're not rogue elements. They do act according to rules. Now, having said that, as I said at the beginning, I take your point on board. You're going into other countries and not necessarily adhering to their laws, and you're doing stuff that a foreign government would not necessarily like. We do that already. I mean, even on the CSE side with respect to signals intercepts, you're intercepting the phone calls of foreign nationals and foreign political agents, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that there's an education campaign again that has to take place. Dispel some of the mythology that these agents are running amok in other countries. But at the same time, they're doing what they have to do to protect Canadians, protect Canadian interests, protect Canadian values. So it's that balance, that equilibrium that you have to strike.
I couldn't agree more. The education of Canadians is going to be an extremely important part of any process on the road to a Canadian Foreign Intelligence Service. Canadians, and I think Canadian governments, expect reciprocity in international affairs. If so, they might not permit a Canadian espionage service to break the anti-espionage laws of hostile foreign countries, as a service would have to do in order to ferret out their secrets. In view of this, would any Canadian government, in your opinion, entertain the idea of having what must constitute a law-breaking service?
Well, I think that's very similar to the question you just asked me in terms of tactics, but also the purpose of any intelligence agency, including a potential foreign intelligence agency for Canada. They're going out there to serve Canadian interests, to protect the Canadian population, to protect our values, basically to support Canada on the world stage and to support our territory at home. So again, I think it's a matter of explaining what intelligence agencies do, and that I don't think you lead again in the communication strategy with we go out and we break the laws of other countries. Don't forget, there are intelligence agencies in this country doing all kinds of bad things as well. I always found it quite interesting when you'd talk to certain politicians, especially when they just come into government, including cabinet ministers, and you'd explain to them what CSE did, and they'd go, "Oh my God, I can't believe that we do this." And I'd say, "What do you think other intelligence agencies around the world do in Canada?
Yes.
Do you think the Russians and the Chinese are trying to intercept our communications, or they don't have human agents around here?" It's the way of the world. It's a rough and tumble world out there, more rougher and more dangerous, more unpredictable than ever. And yes, we believe in a rules-based international order and all of that good stuff. But I think that there's a common understanding throughout the world that this is what intelligence agencies do, and they do it as an extension, as an arm of government policy. That's what it's done. That could be explained to Canadians. And yeah, there might be some Canadians out there who do not want a foreign intelligence agency or more robust foreign intelligence capabilities for that very reason, that it's going to be counter to the charter and it's going to be violating human rights and one thing and another. But again, some of those people you're never going to convince. But I think for the rest of the Canadian population, I think trying to explain why we do this and why we do it the way we do it, keeping in mind there is still a legal framework, and that we do it within certain constraints. I think that ultimately would resonate with Canadians.
Yeah, I agree with you that particularly your point that governments must lead, not follow public opinion. You've touched on another point. Where would a foreign intelligence service fit in government? Let's assume that we did have one, or the government decided to create one. Would we be making a mistake if we made it part of CSIS as opposed to a standalone agency?
So it's always been a two-part debate, I think, in Canada. The first part of the debate: do we need more robust foreign intelligence capabilities? And then if the answer is yes, where do you put those capabilities? And do you create a separate agency altogether, or do you incorporate it into CSIS and expand its mandate with its focus on domestic security to look at foreign intelligence as well? I often said, when I was asked publicly, or even within government, when a minister would ask me, "Do we need a foreign intelligence agency?" I'd say, well, because I was kind of one of those guys who punted down the field, like I was saying earlier. We got so much on our plate now when it comes to security and intelligence challenges, so much that we need to change, so much that we need to reform, from legislation to tools to information gathering, information sharing, all these things, that enhancing our foreign interference capabilities is one thing, but creating a whole new agency is something very different. It would create huge questions of government machinery. I can tell you, when public servants hear the word machinery, they usually run for the exits. because creating a whole new agency or a whole new department is a huge, huge undertaking. It takes a long time. This is why it's often being punted down the road, right? It's just going to take too long. It's going to take too long. It's going to be too expensive. It's going to be too difficult. And so I think one of your previous guests said, it could take a decade. I'd say that's about right. I would say it'd take about 5 to 10 years to get it fully up and running as part of a new agency in terms of hiring everybody, training everybody, getting the resources in place, bricks and mortar, all those things. It would take quite a while. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. And if that's having done that full up assessment I was talking about before, if the government does that full up assessment and the conclusion is it should be a separate agency, then you should make it a separate agency. But one compromise might be to put it in CSIS, at least to start with, because CSIS does have experience and capacity in foreign intelligence collection and assessment. Maybe not as much as we'd like, obviously, but they have it there. Build it up within CSIS, but then review it after 5 years or review it after a decade, and then decide, okay, is this the best place for it to be, or do we now need to look at plan B, which is to create a whole new separate agency? So it's an incremental approach. Crawl before you can walk before you can run. Let's see if it fits within CSIS. And then, but then at the end of the day go, yeah, it does, it's working fine, or no, it's just not right. I mean, you look at our Five Eyes allies and everybody does it with a separate agency. Whether it's in the US with FBI and CIA, or MI6, MI5 in the UK, or ASIO and ASIS in Australia. So they've always done it in terms of separate agencies. If we decide in Canada that we're special and we're unique for some reason, then fine. We can stick it together with CSIS. My gut feeling, given the way it's gone in those allies, is that that's probably the way we'd want to go eventually, and have it in a separate agency. I know you'll have a lot of former CSIS directors arguing the opposite way, but that's probably where I would land. But again, we need to do the in-depth research. We need to go overseas and look at other examples and look at other countries. I think there are 1 or 2 countries on the European continent who do have it combined in terms of a domestic mandate and a foreign mandate. And they can mix those two, and they've done it reasonably well. But let's go look and see what they've done.
Yes, I think the Dutch, for example, have a combined agency. But our close allies, United States, UK, Australia, have decided to keep the services separate.
And they've kept them separate for a long, long time. So you would have thought that if they'd learned something along the way that this wasn't working.
Yes.
Some people have said, well, you take a look at the US model and there are all kinds of turf wars, and it would be better if you didn't constantly have the CIA and the FBI duking it out. Well, they're still there. And no one has taken that tough decision to say, in any of those 3 countries you just mentioned, this isn't working, so let's change it. So it has, all of those structures in those 3 countries have stood the test of time.
And even if it was part of CSIS, the foreign wing and the domestic wing would probably be engaged in turf fighting, even with a common boss.
Turf battles in Ottawa it's what Ottawa does, and it doesn't have to be between departments. It's often inside departments. Some of the worst ones are inside departments. So that's not aimed at CSIS. I'm just saying it's entirely conceivable. I think it would be a tough integration. That's my gut feeling, but I've not worked in CSIS. Some of my former CSIS colleagues or current CSIS colleagues might feel a lot differently, and they probably have they have more expertise than me. So I'd be very interested to hear their views. But from most of the academic work that I've seen, on balance, seems to move in the direction of a separate agency. I know some occasionally think it should be run out of GAC or Foreign Affairs. I don't think that's the way to go at all. I think that's an old thing. That's probably from about 10, 15 years ago.
Do you think that any Canadian government in prospect would have the political maturity to allow the Canadian Foreign Intelligence Service to do the sort of things that have to be done in order for them to gain intelligence, Do you think that the government is mature enough politically to do it?
Well, again, I think that we all have to open our eyes and look at the state of the world, look at what we're facing. I've argued publicly this is the most dangerous the world has been, arguably since the end of the Second World War. We're under threat. Canada cannot live in splendid isolation anymore and think all these threats are somewhere else. And that there will be a government that does show leadership, whether it's a liberal or a conservative government that comes to power. It's not going to happen in the next 18 months before the next election, I don't think. But with the next election comes to power and goes, listen, we've looked at everything out there. We will do a full-up national security review. And if we're going to do a national security review, obviously a foreign intelligence capability or a foreign intelligence agency has to be part of the puzzle, has to be part of the discussion. And so I'd like to think that the government, any incoming government, would not be worried about, what you refer to as dirty tactics or getting our hands dirty overseas, but would see this as being in the national interest, aligning ourselves with allies, and responding to a turbulent, very turbulent world. Don't forget that when the Conservatives came in 2006, they mentioned the creation of a foreign intelligence agency. And again, right after 5 years after 9/11, here we are in a world just as unstable, I would suggest more unstable, more unpredictable, more dangerous in many ways than the immediate post 9/11 world. That a government may come in and go, okay, we're in a similar situation. Let's take a look under the hood. What do we need to do here? And so, foreign intelligence agency, let's do the assessment. Let's have the discussion, and let's make a decision and stop with the punting. Let's go for a touchdown if you want to push the football metaphor a little bit further.
On that note, Mr. Rigby, we want to thank you for being our guest panelist today. We're unfortunately out of time, but this has been a most enlightening exchange. And I don't think any Canadian government that ponders having a foreign secret service should fail to consult you before they make a decision. May I wish you all the best in your current and future endeavors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you again for having me. It was a great conversation. And keep it up. Keep this debate alive.
We certainly will.